I would 100% totally agree with that motto, and that we should promote menopause-friendly workplace policies. 100%. I wrote a really lengthy and detailed article for Brains magazine about the impact of menopause on the workspace. And again, I quoted it. The estimates right now are that it costs the U.S. economy $26 billion a year because women leave the workforce, they downsize their work activities, they have presenteeism and other things that are directly related to the transition of menopause. Ladies, are you ready to take control of your menopause journey? Introducing Mastering the Pause, the ultimate ebook that empowers you with the knowledge and tools to navigate this transformative phase with confidence and grace. Packed with expert guidance on hormone replacement, essential lab tests, personalized diet and lifestyle strategies, this book is your secret weapon to combat menopause-related challenges. Discover how to maintain a healthy metabolism, ward off belly fat, and embrace this new chapter of your life. Download your copy now at guide.hormoneshelp.com. That's guide.hormoneshelp.com. And let's make this a smooth and informed menopause transition today. Okay, I'm going to start with a fact that might surprise you. Did you know that while 100% of women experience menopausal activity, right? You can't get a pass on menopause. It's a significant biological event, of which 85% of women are symptomatic for an average of 8 years. It's estimated to cost the U.S. economy $26 billion a year, and just under 10% of women receive hormone replacement therapy. And it's even more startling, if we look at support for menopause, it is significantly less funded compared to conditions that affect a much smaller part of the population. I'm going to talk about erectile dysfunction. ED receives 4 to 5 times the amount of funding compared to menopausal treatment, and it only affects 17 to 19% of men. So today I'm going to dig into a series of articles that came out over the month of March from the Lancet that posed a empowerment model of menopause. And so I'm going to go through each one of those articles and talk about what they said and provide a lot of context for you as my listener so you can become an informed participant in your own healthcare. So welcome to Menopause Mastery. Let's dig in. So like I said, we're going to talk today about menopause and this idea of the empowerment model and where we are really challenged in the medical and science community about how to really look at menopause as a transitional phase and then also as a biological impact. So first, I'm going to share a story of one of my clients, Linda. So Linda experienced what a lot of us experience. I'll say definitely I have been very vocal about what my 40s were like. I went into early menopausal symptoms actually by 39, and Linda was close to the same. She started experiencing at 42 with things like insomnia, brain fog, irritability, and waves of depression that would kind of come and go. But they seemed to be very cyclical in the beginning, and then it was almost like a depressive blanket landed over her life. She didn't start experiencing vasomotor symptoms of menopause until later, where she got more hot flashes or night sweats. And she also experienced what a lot of us experience too, which is weight gain as all of these hormones start to shift. So, Linda did what most women do. They say, okay, I'm going to go and visit my physician. I'm going to go seek my professional that is there to help me navigate my health and find out what to do. So the first thing that happened is her doctor just told her that was a normal rite of passage, that she should just accept what's happening with her body and that she probably needed some sleep medications because that was her first initial problem. She felt like her sleep was really destructive. And so they gave her a sleep medication and, one of the Ambien-like medications and sent her on her way. A couple of months later, she comes back and talks about, my mood is just not great. I'm really irritable. I just don't feel like myself anymore. And the doctor said, great, now we need to give you an SSRI because you have a deficiency of SSRI. Let's go ahead and stack that on top. Well, the SSRI led to a significant decrease in sense of sexual desire and low libido. And she went back to her doctor later on and talked about that. And the doctor, recommended that maybe she just deal with it and that this is just what it's going to be like. And so by the time I met Linda, she was very frustrated. She was tired, angry, irritable, had brain fog, had insomnia, and really was looking at, gosh, I'm in my late 40s, and my lifespan is going to be on average 83 to 85 years, depending on which studies you read. So I'm looking at another 40 years of feeling like this. And that really doesn't look good. So Linda really found herself what I think most women feel like, is she gets recommended a carousel of medications or cognitive behavior therapy, like you need to deal with it in your head because you're going through menopause. And despite all of this, they were just medication masking of symptoms. So Linda's experience highlights a critical issue. And I think this is where the Lancet articles completely miss the boat. And that's what we're going to get into. Menopause is not just a normal part of life. So is aging. It is a significant health transition with loss of hormonal function that increase the risk for serious conditions like cardiovascular disease, dementia, and osteoporosis. And the truth is women live a lot longer, and we can live anywhere between a third to a half of our life without hormones while carrying these additional risks that are in direct response to the loss of these hormones. This is a significant issue for women. It is not the same for men. And again, like I said earlier, we receive less funding for something 100% of women are going to go through. And compared to erectile dysfunction, no offense, men, I recognize that it's a problem, but it is not going to increase your risk for cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, or dementia. Now, I will argue that erectile dysfunction is a sign of metabolic disease and things like vascular problems, but it is not directly a cause of it, where the loss of hormones during menopause is in a direct effect for lifetime risk of those diseases. So let's go into what the whole recommendations and things coming out of the Lancet came out. So the first article I'm going to review is an empowerment model for managing menopause. So we love that empowerment word because it makes you feel powerful and motivated. So this article really suggested a new approach to managing menopause that goes beyond treating symptoms to encompass a broader empowerment model. The authors really believe that menopause has been over-medicalized, and if you're watching me on video, I'm doing the big old air quotes, and framed as a hormonal deficiency disease by commercial interests, fueling negative attitudes. They propose that empowerment model recognizes the factors that modify the menopause experience, with the patient as an expert in their own condition, and clinical support should be there to actively manage their own care. The key components that they outline in this article, it includes access to evidence-based balance tools, tools supporting treatment decision-making, and supportive clinicians offering treatment as needed through the shared decision-making and challenging the stigma around aging and menopause and creating a menopause-friendly work environment. The experience of menopause, this is going to be their argument, varies wildly. And so there's no universal syndrome, and that only vasomotor symptoms, which are your hot flashes and night sweats, vaginal dryness, and possibly the sleep disturbances are the clear representable symptoms that are attributed to menopause, and that menopause should be destigmatized as a natural part of aging. All right, so what is the intention of this? So the intention of this article was to posit that the empowerment model for menopause recognizes modifying factors like you should have a shared decision-making with your provider. No duh. We should always have a shared decision-making. Medicine is not a totalitarian experience. It is not a dictatorship. The person with the most decision-making is the person's body, the person who's living in it. And so the simple fact is if you're in an environment where your doctor is acting as a dictator, they should be fired because it is a shared decision-making, you working as a partner with your physician. And then challenging negative attitudes. The goal is to really optimize women's experience of this transition, right? So the assumptions they made in this article is that menopause has been over-medicalized and framed negatively by commercial interests. And then if we empower women, they could just feel better about it. They can work on their headspace about aging and all the symptoms that go along with this, and they'd be okay. And that they're saying they're providing evidence-based information of what to do and what to expect with menopause. They want to train clinicians to listen with empathy and offer treatment as needed, right? Both of things that should not have to be trained. It should be ingrained into medicine. And we need to challenge ageism and the stigma around menopause as a period of decline. I would 100% totally agree with that motto. And that we should promote menopause-friendly workplace policies. 100%. I wrote a really lengthy and detailed article for Brains Magazine about the impact of menopause on the workspace. And again, I quoted it. The estimates right now are that it costs the U.S. economy $26 billion a year because women leave the workforce, they downsize their work activities, they have presenteeism and other things that are directly related to the transition of menopause. So what do I think about this article, right? And obviously this is my opinion, but this was an opinion article, so let's go ahead and fire off. I agree that we, particularly in the United States, have ageism as one of our major drivers of this transition and the feeling of being invisible. People like Paulina Poroskova is talking about one of the most beautiful supermodels ever, has been very vocal online about what it felt like to go through this and the invisibility in her own life, in her own relationships, and then out in the public as you go into this era that women are old when they hit menopause. I agree 100%, and that we need to challenge these negative attitudes. Now, the argument that it's been over-medicalized, I think it's interesting because hormone replacement therapy was the standard of care starting in the 50s and onward until the Women's Health Initiative. And at that point, that was the standard of care as women went into menopause. Now, since the Women's Health Initiative, cardiovascular disease and death is still on the rise in women. Osteoporosis is radically on the rise in women, and dementia is radically on the rise for women. So the reality is the treatment of menopause with hormonal therapy has long been a standing treatment. And it is not because all of a sudden pharma got behind it and started pushing the use of hormone therapy. It actually was the standard of care until a very poorly done study was picked up and ran with by media. So let's face it, the empowerment model is good because it does say, hey, women should be in the driver's space. We should be in partnership with our providers, and we should respect women's decision-making about how they need to improve care. And I don't think every woman needs hormone replacement. I'm just being really honest. I know that from a fact because we see women from all different walks of life, all different experiences over the last 2 decades in my clinic. And some women absolutely feel like this is their needed treatment. And there are other women that sail through this experience just fine. But I think telling women that they're wrong and they're being disempowered by looking into things that reduce their risk for disease and improve their overall life for up to 4 decades is also a misogynistic view and a way of demoralizing women in this environment. So let's talk about the next one. So the next one was optimizing health after early menopause. So this article focused on 8 to 12% of women globally who experience early menopause. So these are the women that go through menopause somewhere between 40 and 45. The diagnosis is often delayed and distressing, especially for those still hoping to get pregnant. The authors propose considering early menopause on a spectrum between premature ovarian insufficiency, which is menopause before 40, and typical menopause timing. Both early menopause and premature ovarian insufficiency increase the risk of chronic conditions, things like osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease. So not only do we possibly have fertility issues, and there's a lot of great things going on in research today to preserve ovarian function for women, and Boss Ovary being one of those that I just watch online, and I'm like, man, I just love what you're doing. But not only do we lose fertility, but our risk for those diseases are greater. So the earlier you go through menopause, whether surgical or not, your risk for cardiovascular disease and things like osteoporosis actually increase over your peers who might go through it in the 50s. And there are guidelines that exist for premature ovarian insufficiency, but not early menopause. So we're missing, so they say, okay, if you've got premature ovarian insufficiency and you're looking for fertility, we have some guidelines. But if you just happen to be a woman who's 42 and is in complete menopause, hey, guess what? We don't need to look at you because you are only bikini medicine. Your only value is your breasts and your reproductive organs. And if those don't work, we don't need to worry about it, which is where medicine has basically resided all these years. And so menopause hormone therapy is generally recommended until the age of early menopause or menopause for those without contraindications. So in some cases, they would say, there might be some short-term benefits. So this is where the recommendation of the lowest dose for the shortest period of time comes. It's like, oh, let these women who go into menopause early go through treatment, but let's not actually continue that treatment. So when we look at the optimal duration and the long-term benefits for early menopause and treatment compared to like the premature ovarian insufficiency that we look in fertility, right now that's a gray area because we haven't really defined what this is for women. So ultimately, this article is saying, hey, yeah, we've got women who we know have fertility issues and we have sort of recommendations there, but we don't really have recommendations for the other women who are not trying to get pregnant. And this article argues for counseling on healthy lifestyles, right? So let's work on your diet. Let's work on your nutrition. Let's work on your sleep, 100% of which I agree, right? I'm a nutrition professional and researcher, so I 100% always agree with those. But you could be eating a really healthy diet. You could be exercising adequately and appropriately for your body. You could be doing every bit of sleep hygiene possible for yourself, and you could still be highly symptomatic and also increasing your risk for long-term disease and morbidity. So it's not just that simple. It's not magical, right? So it's a very understudied condition when we look at early menopause, and it really warrants a lot more diagnostic management opportunities to look at the short-term and long-term health outcomes. And it's way more common than what people think. And there's a lot of hormones that may contribute to this, not part of my topic today, but I've talked a lot about how the hormone symphony plays in, and it may affect things like reproductive fertility. So what are the recommendations that were made in the Lancet? It considered early menopause a distinct condition between the spectrum of premature ovarian insufficiency and just typical menopause that happens in your late 40s, early 50s. And they do recommend using and providing a diagnostic framework to at least identify it, but they still lean heavily on counseling on diet, lifestyle, and not really looking at hormone replacement therapy as a line of defense. So my argument in this entire thing is we should be addressing and putting a lot more effort into understanding ovarian failure and preserving ovarian health and why we see so much more infertility issues today than we saw just a couple decades ago, because it is epidemic and it is not just women being more aware, it is actually a problem. And there's underlying issues going on here, and it deserves some serious funding. So the next article that the Lancet put out was one called Promoting Good Mental Health Over the Menopause Transition. So this article has evidence on mental health conditions during menopause, right? There are concerns about increased anxiety and depression that may shape women's experiences and expectations. However, these authors found no strong evidence for universal increased risk of depressive symptoms or major depressive disorders. This is in direct opposition to lots of other research out there that really shows major depressive disorder and depressive symptoms as women go into the menopausal transition. And those that had PMDD and or post-pregnancy depression, we see a greater increase in that as they go through the transition. And there is, I will say, I agree with them, there's limited prospective data suggesting menopause may be a vulnerable period for the first onset of depressive disorder. But let's face it, I can tell you from just anecdotal evidence of what I see in clinic and what I hear from all my clinicians and my friends that have been in this industry for 2 decades, absolutely depression, anxiety, irritability, which I would argue is equal in those, is a major concern. And especially if women have depressive symptoms previously, we know that those women may be more vulnerable. And also those with more severe vasomotor symptoms like sleep disturbances, hot flashes, night sweats seem to be more correlated to previous depressive disorder. So if you've had depression before, if you're experiencing night sweats and hot flashes and other things, that may also be a harbinger for potential mood issues that may arise as you're going through menopause. So these authors argued that the evidence was insufficient to conclude that anxiety, bipolar, psychosis, any of those risks are elevated during menopause, and that they would attribute the psychological symptoms as something that is outside of menopause, and they feel it's harmful to look at these symptoms as a part of menopause and that it may actually delay accurate diagnosis and treatment. I would argue just the opposite. So as somebody who spent several years digging through the research about how hormones are metabolized and how they interact with your brain chemistry and neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and GABA, in the gut especially, they act on the same receptors. They metabolize through the same detox and biotransformation pathways in the liver. And if you have the idea that there is no interaction there, you are being very limited in your understanding of the human biochemistry. And that, yes, I think it's important to assess whether a woman's anxiety or depression is hormone related or not. And could it be compared to some other more increased risk psychological disorder? I agree that should be looked at. But when you get a good medical history that takes more than 2 minutes to get, and you start to ask all the right questions, often these symptoms appear at the same time as all the other symptoms that are obvious with menopause. So to critically look at this, we have to actually identify what is really going on here. And yes, we do sometimes overgeneralize mental health risk and sort of say, oh, this just happens to women. We've been doing that since the late 1800s with the use of the word hysteria that was used to describe women in that menopausal zone. And that we know that certain biosocial factors will increase that vulnerability to depression. I would say just our societal experience and treatment of women in this time period absolutely leads to that. So, of course, these authors, provided evidence that women, most of which aren't at risk for real mental health issues during menopause. So, yes, that's great. The reality is that maybe we experience these fluctuating moods, but we don't necessarily need to take medications. Then I would argue, why is SSRIs our first line defense to treat menopause, right? I can guarantee you, if you go ask women, if they were given any recommendations at all, almost always it's either a sleep medication or antidepressant. So we should really look at this and challenge the idea that depression treatments over menopause with depression drugs is a Band-Aid on a hormonal change that is occurring in 100% of women, and 85% of us experience some sort of symptoms for a prolonged period of time. Now, they also put out another article about menopause treatment after cancer and, underdiagnosed and undertreated problem. So cancer survivors, particularly estrogen and progesterone receptor and even HER2 positive survivors, breast cancer, uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, often experience menopause symptoms. They are thrown into menopause at treatment, right? So if you're 35, you're going to be in menopause when you go through breast cancer treatment, and even at young ages. And this is an underdiagnosed and undertreated problem. So essentially what happens is these women get completely cut off from their hormones. And there's a huge severity of vasomotor symptoms, the genital and urinary symptoms, things like urinary incontinence, urinary frequency, UTIs, vaginal infections, vaginal atrophy, sexual dysfunction, psychological symptoms. And those are significantly higher among cancer survivors compared to age-matched women without a history of cancer, right? So imagine if you haven't gone through this, I have friends that have gone through this, is you get all of the horrible symptoms of menopause amplified overnight as a younger woman. And you're also taking medications that drive those symptoms in a way that's much greater, right? There is a lack of guidance on oncology and menopausal assessment and management. And cancer survivors with menopausal symptoms report a huge unmet need here. And this is coming from the Lancet, so I agree 100% with the Lancet. And those with hormone-sensitive cancers face massive restrictions on treatment, like hormonal therapy. And contraindications can also limit these hormonal symptoms because, again, a lot of times we're using hormone-suppressing medications like anastrozole and, all kinds of medications. So here's the thing. At what point, and this is different for every woman, I'm asking this as a curious question as a scientist and a researcher, at what point do you say, is my life today worth more than, and my experience of life today worth more than the length of my life? I'm not sure. I mean, I have some friends that have gone through cancer and we have these conversations all the time. And at what point do you say you have to consider the quality of life you have now compared to the length of life? I think some people would say, I don't care. I want length of life and I want length of life over everything. And then I also know that several women will say, I would rather have high quality of life and have a better life lived that might be slightly shorter. And I can't answer that question. I don't think any researcher can, but I do think that we have to look at it through those lenses. And the truth is, oncology practice lacks coordination with other specialties. They lack comprehensive care. They are there to address the cancer activity and the framework, but they don't really address menopause. And they don't have menopause assessment in cancer care, and they haven't really developed management guidelines and multidisciplinary care pathways. And if you read the book Estrogen Matters by Avram Blooming and Carol Tarvis, which if you have listened to my podcast and you haven't read that book, shame on you. Go get the Audible right now or download the book and just get through it. Because the reality is not every woman who has gone through cancer is excluded from hormone replacement therapy based on the research. And so if you have been basically gaslighted for asking questions about this, I would highly recommend Estrogen Matters as a book so you can be an informed participant in your healthcare. Right? So the truth is we have a long way to go in oncology practices. And I agree with the Lancet that we need a really comprehensive care plan that addresses the entire woman, not just with the medical management of the cancer itself, but the quality of life the woman is going to experience from that point on. And I think we need to standardize some assessments, but also provide a broader swath of treatment and support for women going through this care. Just because you have a hormone-sensitive cancer doesn't mean you can't use hormones at all. There's actually good research, and your better oncologists will actually use things like vaginal estriol to support your urinary tract and vaginal health, right? So it doesn't say that you can't have anything. I just think we have a huge gap in the oncology treatment arena that really requires education. And I think it should be standardized, and everybody should go through massive education that has been redesigned based on the literature, both pre-Women's Health Initiative and post-Women's Health Initiative, without the muddied lens of the Women's Health Initiative, right? And so the last article is really looking at this idea of optimizing health after menopause, right? And during menopause. And what's my all-over argument, right? And so how do I see all of these? So I'm going to kind of break this down to you so you could really get it, right? So the empowerment model, it's got a lot of bias, if you ask me. It's valuable, right? Because I do think that we see women as, in our society, as kind of old, dried up, leftover, no longer valuable. But it's inadequate because it doesn't emphasize the serious health risks. So if you look at any of the research, just going through menopause increases our risk of fatal stroke and heart attack. Women who are in the ER are more likely to have a fatal event in the ER, having a stroke and a heart attack, because we don't present like men. Our risk for these increase when we go through menopause, and it is the loss of estrogen that drives that, right? So cardiovascular disease is a direct response to the loss of those hormones. Osteoporosis. One of the main drivers of bone remodeling is the estrogen hormone in women. And guess what? Men. If you suppress estrogen in men, you will also see bone mineral density changes. And so the loss of estrogen increases bone turnover, decreases bone building, and makes us have brittle and less strong bones. So ultimately, osteoporosis is one of the leading causes of accidental injury and death in women over 50. So what does that mean? That leads to a lot of debilitated experiences and often early death. So that is in direct response to loss of hormones. That's not just aging, that's loss of hormones. And then dementia. If you look at Mosconi's group's work and the literature and meta-analysis that they did last year, looking at 6 million women, they found that replacing estrogen early in the menopause transition reduced your risk for dementia by 34%. Now, we have a lot of places to go there. We need to be looking at your bioidentical forms that have been available since most of those studies were done. That was all done on oral estrogen and oral Premarin, Prempro. And those have their own risks, which we can go into on another podcast. But the reality is the risk for dementia, I would say, is probably one of the things most of us fear the most. As somebody who's caring for a mother who went through a heart attack and a stroke that basically created instant dementia, there is nothing I think people would fear more than to have a physical body that's present and a brain that is not. And so the loss of our hormones increase that risk universally. Now, some women, again, may not be as great a risk as others because of genetics, but the simple fact is it's going to increase our risk. So we have to look at that. So there's bias in these articles that are overlooking at it. And that idea that the only reason we talk about it is this over-medicalization and it's a drive for revenue is completely wrong. If we look at the articles about managing menopause after cancer, it provides valuable information about this subgroup, but it may not sufficiently really go into the depth of what happens when a woman goes through early menopause, right? So imagine, we already know that early menopause causes more risk for osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, and dementia. But these women now have it earlier, which even with no cancer at all increases your risk for earlier onset for these diseases. So women really face these risks, and particularly cancer survivors need a more holistic view of how to look at this, right? And then, that looking at that early menopause spectrum, I think if there's any group that we absolutely should be using hormone therapy in without question is the women who end up in early menopause, like at 40 years old. I have friends of mine that have told me, I stopped having a period in my late 30s, and my doctor told me I was just fine. Well, we know, again, those risks for cardiovascular disease amplify. Our risk for osteoporosis amplifies. So if any group needs to really have that addressed, we need to separate it from premature ovarian failure and only looking at it when it's a fertility issue and start addressing it as a real issue. So I appreciate the Lancet's argument for empowering women, but I think it leaves you with this question, and this is what I want to leave you with, and then I'm going to tell you how to kind of take the next steps. I think you want to ask your question, where is the balance between this idea of women should be empowered to grow older? I feel better today at 54 going on 55 than I did at 40. I also feel more empowered because there is a beauty to this time period of life. The crap just falls away and you start really feeling more, I think, at home in some ways. Even though your hormones might be all over the place, there's this sense of purpose, I think, that's hiding in the background, driving forward. At least it was for me. And so I think we have to look at it that way and not tell women that you're getting dried up old and invisible as you go through menopause. But I think we also need to not just look at menopause as a rite of passage and just part of the aging process. It is a significant biological event that has long-term effects on your morbidity and mortality, right? Which means your quality of life, quality of health, and your end of life. And so we have to look at both at the same time. So I'd love to know how you feel about that. And I'd love for you to share that online, share that in your comments. Share, what do you feel? Do you feel empowered? Do you feel like I want to look at it that way? Like it's just I am empowered by the experience and forget it? Or do you want to look at it as a biological event? I think there's a marrying of the two. I think we can be very empowered and also proactive with our biological history and actually improving our health. So I'd love to hear that. So now you go, God, Betty, what do I do next? I need to be empowered. So I want to empower you to take this next step. Right? I want you to advocate for yourself. So I want you to then kind of look at your experience with your healthcare provider, whoever that is, gynecologist, primary care, whoever that may be, family practice, and ask yourself these questions. Do I have a partner that, number one, acts as a partner and not a dictator? If they dismiss your questions, if they dismiss your concerns, if they brush you off, blow you off, or start medication stacking to cover up symptoms and then another medication to cover up the symptoms that were created by the drug they gave you for the other symptoms, I highly recommend that you take a moment to step back and look at what is it you want, right? What is it you want? Because I think ultimately we are empowered in this world, and there are people in my arena, other healthcare providers. We're all online trying to share information with you and trying to help you get to the right providers that look at you as an empowered patient and as a person, as an N of one. Yes, we have population data and we have clinical controlled trials and we have lots of things to inform evidence-based medicine. And if you haven't listened to my podcast on that, it's a couple weeks ago, I go into a lot of where the evidence is lacking in what we call the evidence-based medicine and particularly medical prescribing, because women have been left out of medical prescribing and studies for decades, hundreds of years actually, up until 1993, and it was still a huge gap. So you need to know that somebody is there looking at you as a person, as an individual, and that your concerns, your lab work, your overall goals are more important than what they think the cookbook says, right? And the cookbook is the kind of standard of care. The reality is that's a relationship between you and your doctor, and the insurance companies insert themselves in between and say, we're only covering certain things, but they don't have your best heart in mind, your best experience in mind. They have their dollars in mind. And so if your provider doesn't do that for you, I think it's time to shop around, right? And time to get educated. And listening to myself and the many other people that are in this arena are going to help you get educated. And I want you to feel empowered. Never, ever before were women in a position where we have the leverage that we do. We have the Sprint for Women's Health, which was a $100 million investment by the government this year to invest in women-centric businesses and initiatives to help move women forward, particularly women in this lifespan. Matter of fact, we're working on a proposal right now for that. We have NIH dedicating money for the first time to women's health research. And so we are in a position, and my call to action is to motivate you to step forward and demand, right? We outnumber men in this age space. We also have more disposable income, and we have more capacity to make change. We make 87% of buying decisions in the home. So the reality is, ladies, you are powerful, and you can demand what you expect. And if they don't give it, move on, right? Peace out. So I want you to know that, and you have an extraordinarily resilient body, and you have to be able to make, proactive, informed health management decisions for your own body. And I want you to think about every time you get told something and layer it against your own experience and decide whether you're going to adopt that opinion or not. So the last thing I want to recommend is earlier on in the podcast, I made a recommendation for a guide to help you understand menopause transition and some very basic but very profound activities that you can take from a nutrition, lifestyle, and diet aspect to help you understand this transition. And so don't forget, I want you to go to guide.hormoneshelp.com. That's guide.hormoneshelp.com, and you can download a free copy of that ebook. And it's there to help you really master the pause, right? Let's get on it, master the pause, and be empowered. So thank you for listening to Menopause Mastery. I can't wait to see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.